turmoil. And, there's a much more softer feeling from Delhi towards Lahore, from Lahore towards Delhi, Punjab. Am I clear? Yeah, and it does bother me that history has repeated itself now as though it's an estuary, a river in different forms. It's not keeping the shape we thought it would, And I'm very disappointed that so many people have sacrificed so much, lost so much without any fault of their own. And this is going on and on. It's endlessly going on,
I mean, something that I would like to come in on is that, I've been writing quite a bit about partition recently, and I had a long piece in Outlook, which was a kind of what-if speculation. What if Nehru and Mountbatten hadn't rushed into partition and allowed the Cabinet Mission Plan and the Wavell Plan to have actually held together the subcontinent as a loose federation and shared power with Jinnah. To my surprise, the most virulent opposition and attacks I got was from Tamil South Indians, and a particular Tamil South Indian friend who had suffered in any way from partition. And the response was, what on earth? We already have far too many Muslims in this country. Can you imagine having 500 million more Muslims? We would have had 500 million more problems. But that kind of communalism I never got from my uncle, who was a Punjabi from Lahore, who had to, evacuate and move to Delhi. He was always, he felt a kind of cultural bond with the Punjab. But I think, as you say, Gujaratis, Maharashtrians, South Indians can be the most virulently anti-Pakistan, anti-Muslim people in the subcontinent.
I think the difference here really is, can you hear?
Should we just try and sort this audio out once and for all, yeah? So, first question, when I speak or the panelists speak, can you hear us? Okay. Now, we have a problem because of the echo, right? Can you switch off the monitors? Is that causing the problem?
Okay.
It's not a problem with the monitors. Okay.
Okay. What I was saying was, the difference is between history as experience and history as ideology. So people who experienced the partition, they experienced a great deal of trauma, they experienced violence, they experienced displacement, but it was a kind of a human experience, which they can process through various kinds of human sentiments. But when partition, is encountered as an ideology, then you can only see as, the fanatic behind it. You can only see the looter behind it. You cannot see partition as a kind of a human experience. I mean, just take one example. In India, the figure of partition is often through the figure of dismemberment. That here was a country that was dismembered. And people often speak about vivisection, and that leads you to a kind of an ideological understanding of what the partition was. Whereas people who experience, you talk to refugees who came from Punjab and, came to Delhi, they have very painful memories, but those painful memories are not processed through this, this idea of vivisection or the idea of dismemberment, the idea of kind of losing your limb. And so even if they entertain various kinds of, very distressing memories, they do not translate themselves into this kind of an ideological reflex.
Right. So I think this is quite an interesting sort of binary that I'd like to push further, which is that the narrative that is experienced, such as the Punjab experiences partition, versus the narrative that is transmitted, which is that the rest of the country receives an idea of what it was. So given that when we are grappling with a beast like history, a number of these, the narrative that we're getting is a mishmash of these two contesting things of, say, Punjabi historians or, say, Bapsi's novels writing about partition as it's experienced versus historians working in archives kind of pulling out a certain idea. How good a guide is the past to the present then?
Well, you know, I mean, one really great difference that one sees in the treatment of partition between, let's say, novelists and historians is that novelists have often been able to actually deal with the experience of violence, of murder, of killing. I mean, it's there in her novels, it's there in all the kind of, you know, Manto stories on partition. Compare that to historians' account of partition. It's clean, it's bloodless, it's about Mountbatten, it's about Jinnah, it's about who said what, you know, the cabinet mission and, you know, and so on. Because, I mean, it's partly because, you know, historians really deal with the kind of public record of what went on, whereas the novelists deal with the psyches, the motivations, the experiences, the desires and emotions. And so it's not surprising that in the literature on partition, the most compelling and poignant ones have come from, you know, fiction writers and not historians.
So, do you mind if I go to Bapsi first and then we come to you? So, ma'am, of course, you heard what he said, right? You heard what Gyan said?
Yeah, Gyan was saying something like novelists are able to put in more emotion, more description, more everything.
Just
and
a quick,
actually, I mean, I would rather read Tolstoy to understand history than a pure, dry historian. But then I've not read enough history to pass such a judgment. You know, I've not read Macaulay. My reading is limited to fiction, but I have experienced certain things, and as a fiction writer, you do sort of imbue everything with emotion, sometimes with a bias, sometimes with your own opinion. So it gives it, I think, a different life altogether. Whereas the pure historical perspective is perhaps more pure. I don't know how it is. But I think they all have their uses, and the past certainly is reflected all the time in our lives. You know, just within my own personal life, I was married in Bombay, then I got married back in Lahore, then, you know. So every time this changeover reflected in partition for me, you know, because it had very bad repercussions on my life. And I think this had very bad repercussions on the lives of thousands of people who were uprooted, who actually lived through that history.
Tell us about the characters of Ice Candy Man. Where did they come from? Were these people you knew? Was this research you did? Was this a story you heard? Where did those powerful characters come from?
Sorry, I didn't get your question. Can you translate?
Well, Aman was saying, could you tell him more about the characters of
Ice Candy
Man?
Ice Candy Man.
Where did the characters come from?
Well, you know, I wanted to bring the character of Aya. Aya was the character, in a way, around whom Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Ice Candy Man, Ice Candy Man was Muslim, Masya was Muslim, then there was the government house gardener who was Hindu, and Aya is Hindu. But, you know, at that time, Lahore was very cosmopolitan. It had a lot of color. It had mixed society is always more colorful. And gradually, as I was growing up, I could find it becoming more and more puritanical. You know, because you become monochrome. You cannot have one religion only or one culture only. It becomes very dry. But Ice Candy Man plays the role of a catalyst in a way. He is also a very, he is a lover, he's a poet, he is in love with Aya, he follows her to Amritsar. But I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Earth 1947? Yeah. Well, yeah.
Show of hands.
Well, thank you. That's a fair amount of hands. But the ending in the book is a little different from the ending in the film. Because in the book, the film ends where Aya is kidnapped by Ice Candy Man and his group, which makes him into a total villain, Whereas in the book, he becomes more of a poet, a more kinder person, a more of a lover, and he follows her to Amritsar. We don't know what happens after that. I couldn't go beyond that. But when Deepa Mehta was making the movie, I said, look, I don't like this ending where it's ending. She said, but she tried to fit it in. But a book is not, a film is not a talking book. So you cannot fit everything into it. So she could only build a story around the triangle of love to bring around a different plot, a different thing. But she stuck to the spirit of the book, certainly.
Well, I would like to make a plea for historical writing not being emotionless and passionless and dispassionate. I think, the best historical writing does cover emotions. It covers human loss and tragedies. I can't think of an example on partition, but certainly if we go back to someone like Macaulay, whom I've written about, Macaulay exemplified narrative history par excellence. He wrote with great passion about events like the Glencoe massacre, in which Jacobite rebels were massacred by British troops in Scotland. He went to Glencoe to experience the geography and topography and atmosphere of the place. And that was a style of historical writing which went out of fashion, I think, a bit with post-colonial studies, which became, very heavily into jargon and kind of over-analysis of things rather than actually telling a story. But I think the wheel has now turned full circle, and I think narrative history has reappropriated that territory. So I don't think there is any hard and fast dividing line between good historical fiction, which is rooted in fact and solid research, and good historical writing. An example I can give is Simon Sharma, who has written on, the best book I think ever written on the French Revolution, called Citizens, which is full of narratives, full of emotion, full of human passion.
Absolutely, you're quite right. But there's also this, now that I'm moving back to the present, I met some Indian gentlemen who'd come over to Lahore, a younger person, last year, and that person said, oh, partition is over for us. We are too young. We don't remember it. It's done and done with. And for them, they were looking at the city from a different perspective. So there is a difference between the young person looking at the immediate past and the older person. So I wonder if you can reflect on that.
I think, it refers back to what Gyan was saying earlier about ideology and experience. And I think the younger people you're talking about, partly it's an ideological response. So if they look at something like partition, it's seen, they've grown up with the idea of Pakistan as a rival and a hostile neighbor. And that's all it is to them. And the common cultural bonds, etc., are, pretty much forgotten. I'm told it's very much the same in Pakistan. I'm told by Pakistani friends of mine that, most Pakistanis would be appalled at the idea of reunification with India. And they would think, oh, well, whatever our problems are, we'd be worse off if we were back in India. So it is a generational thing, yeah.
That also, then, of course, there's also this longing for Indian films, for and the longing from the Indian side for some of Pakistani clothes and models. And, there is this common cultural bond which one cannot forget. There is the commonality of eating habits, of talking habits, of joking, which is quite different from, let's say, when I live in America. I cannot associate with people the same way I can with people in India or Pakistan or Bombay or among my own Parsi community.
Right. Do you want to jump in on this? Okay. So if we try and move this conversation forward a bit, so I've been reading Arshia Sattar's translation of the Ramayana. And in the foreword, she talks about how there's a school of thought that says that every classic, like say the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, should be retranslated every 20 years in an attempt to essentially understand it afresh. So that's how she actually in some ways justifies her translation of Valmiki's Ramayana, that, you know, it's been translated before, so why do it again? And her answer is that perhaps every now and then we need to just revisit that text and translate it again. And that got me thinking about, we've talked about the past and we've talked about this linearity of how, you know, past shows up in the present. But how does our changing experience of the present affect the way we look back? So, for instance, ma'am talks about how she met this chap who said, partition's not a big deal anymore. And it could be that 20 years from now, when the history of India or Pakistan is written, then partition isn't the central motive anymore. It could be the 62 war. It could be Kargil for another generation of people, right? That if they're like, what is that defining moment around which we're going to center this history, rather than choosing the partition, they may actually choose something else. So, Gyan, is this something that you've looked at, thought about as a historian?
Well, as a historian, it is often said, to write good history, you try to occupy the past, and that you can achieve a certain description or fullness of description if you are able to imagine yourself and place yourself in that period. If you can place yourself in the shoes of your protagonist, all that's very good. But on the other hand, if you placed yourself completely in, let's say, 1947, and you would be faced with the same confusion that the actors in 1947 faced with things going around them. So you have to actually occupy the present as well as the past in order to understand it. So if you're talking about, let's say, retranslation of Ramayana, obviously, if you don't occupy the present, you cannot even understand what are the questions that you would ask that text, the classical text, without a kind of a sense of where you're coming from. So there is no way that you can